Hey everyone, so today I want to be talking about the new Netflix show You and talk about some of the ins and outs of the show. So if you have watched it, this is the place for you. If you haven't watched it, there are going to be spoilers, so you may want to skip this video. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So when we think about Joe, we think about somebody who is very complex. Joe has had a lot of reinventions over the years. He's been in multiple places. He's had a family. He's had a son. He is in a space where he's really reinventing himself. He has gone to Europe in search of Marianne because he has been convinced that she's really the one that got away and she's the one that will make his life better. And in some ways, I think he thinks she may be the love of his life. However, when he does get to Europe, he sees her. A lot of things happen in that short span of time, and he recognizes that she's actually afraid of him. And when you think about it, I mean, from what Marianne knows about Joe, there's a lot to be afraid of. And so we see Joe really in this place of frustration, and he's in this place of building himself. He's in this place of being a professor himself and dealing with students and also growing his social circles. So he's connecting with new people, he's making new friends, and he's deciding what is the best course of action in order to eventually win back Marianne. But we see a lot of twists and turns in this new season. And I think one thing that stood out to me as a clinical therapist is the fact that Joe isn't always aware of what's happening. We see Joe think of himself as rational. We see Joe do a lot of things in order to try to be as normal as possible. And one thing that comes through in this season is that Joe really isn't normal. He tries to think he is. He tries to be a good person of sorts. And his whole performance in this season really makes you think about, the fact of, do bad people do good things? Do good people do bad things? Do bad people do good things? Do bad people do bad things? Is Joe a bad person? I mean, it could be argued yes or no, because he has committed crimes. He has harmed people. He has harmed families. He can't stop himself from a lot of this compulsion that's happening. However, one thing that was a recent twist that came at the last half of the season was the fact that Joe is actively hallucinating. And that's not something I think we saw in some of the other previous seasons. He's having auditory hallucinations. He's having command hallucinations. These are all things that raise red flags when it comes to somebody's competence, when it comes to somebody's ability to distinguish reality from fantasy. Joe really has a lot of challenges, and he really honestly needs an antipsychotic medication or at least an evaluation from a mental health provider in order to get to the bottom of this, because his symptoms have gotten to the point where he really needs medical or psychiatric intervention. And that's something that really comes through throughout this season, that he's doing things that he's not aware of, and then he finds out about it after the fact. He's creating these very vivid fantasies, and these people are real to him. It's really similar to the whole show Dexter, when he talks about his dark passenger and how his dad always appears in these random instances and tells him what to do. Joe has a dark passenger. And with this dark passenger, Joe is really in a place where he has to figure out what he wants to do. He's having these random people that have been harmed around him. He doesn't know what happened, but then he finds out at the end, oh man, it's really me. And so Joe doesn't necessarily get a chance to have some really good introspection. And he's also displaying some of the traits that we think of when we think of a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Now, as a therapist, I'm very, very reluctant to say somebody is schizophrenic or not, just because it's so important to make sure that people meet the appropriate criteria. Schizophrenia is a clinical diagnosis, and there has to be a specific criteria met for that diagnosis. However, in this case of Joe, we've seen a lot happen over the seasons. And through what's happened throughout the seasons, I think we can make a really good case that Joe has schizophrenia or some other psychotic disorder. He's having command hallucinations. He's having paranoia. He's having delusions. He thinks of himself as better than others in a lot of ways. He has this superiority complex. That's really interesting to see, especially with all the stuff he's gone through over the years. He truly believes that there's nothing wrong with him. And that's something that we see in individuals who a lot of times have a schizophrenia diagnosis, that they are unaware that something's wrong. They think that the problem lies in everybody else around them, but there's nothing wrong with them. And so that's one of the reasons why schizophrenia disorders, or even personality disorders of types, are sometimes referred to as being ego systonic, which basically means that it's pleasing to the ego, which means that people are going to be so much more less likely to seek help because they believe that nothing's wrong with them and everything's wrong with the people around them. And so that a lot of times is the barrier to care when it comes to getting assistance, getting resources and support for these individuals, because in order to actually receive treatment and to get prescriptions and to go through the whole assessment process, you do have to actually believe there's a problem. And the only, I think, exception to that would be if you were mandated to seek therapy or to be on medication. But other than that, if you don't believe there's a problem and treatment at that point is still voluntary, then you're going to be a lot less likely to seek support because you don't believe anything's wrong. So, going back to Joe, he is in a lot of trouble. And one thing that comes out throughout the seasons is that he's doing things that he's not aware of. When we think about the whole situation with Marianne and how she unfortunately died, from the point that she got into the cage, you know, a lot of time, in a lot of ways, I think her fate was sealed, because Joe is someone who really tries to cover his tracks, and he tries to think that he has the best intentions, but in a lot of ways, his delusions take over. And we see that happening over and over again with all of the whodunit parts of this season. He's wondering why he's in this space of doing all these things. He's trying to get to the bottom of it. And really, I think at the end of the season, he basically finally says, you know what, this is who I am. This is what I do. And I'm going to try to use my powers for good, or I'm at least going to try to use my powers in a way that shields me from further prosecution, or any prosecution of that matter. And as the season closes, we see Joe really start to own his story and share like different nuanced ideas of his perspective that, you know, that make him lovable, that make him likable, but also don't necessarily shed light on who he is as a person and actually how dangerous he is to society and to those around him. Because Joe does tend to harm people who he's close to at this point. We've gone from random strangers, we've gone from acquaintances to people that he knows and has loved. So that is some of the continual red flags that have happened throughout the season. And so if you have any other thoughts about this full season of You, please feel free to put it in the comment section below. I'll be making some other videos about some things that I've noticed from a mental health perspective. My name is Indoctrinated Doctorate, and I have a PhD in psychology. I work as a psychology professor, and I'm also a clinical therapist. So please put your comments and thoughts below, and I'll catch you on the next video. Have a great one.